Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another exciting episode of Paul Brown Show. This evening, my guest will be Miss Bea Cote. Cote?
Good.
Hey,
yeah.
And she deals with domestic violence, a very important issue in our community. How you doing, ma'am?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
Great. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
I've been in Charlotte for 22 years.
Okay.
And I'm from Rock Hill.
All right. Right.
So I came like in a circle and came back. My history is working as a social worker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker.
Yes,
and also a marriage and family therapist. But I ended up doing work with domestic violence offenders starting in 1999.
Okay.
And that's the population I've been working with since.
What made you want to be dealing with domestic violence, but the offenders?
I had worked in child protective services, and I thought that not enough attention was paid to the abusers, and I thought somewhat wishfully that if these guys knew how to become non-abusive, with the motivation being not losing their children or getting their kids back, that would be pretty powerful. And that would be a way to, in other words, that would be a big motivation. And I wanted to see that. I wanted to see that happen. I wanted to see them changing for the sake of their kids.
Is an abuser, is that some type of form of mental illness that they may have?
No, not at all. And in fact, our program is not mental health based, so it's not a clinical program. We can't bill insurance. Domestic violence is nowhere in the mental health Bible, the DSM-5, and that's because it's a behavior that is based on decisions that are normally based on an entitlement of some kind. So these guys often feel that they have a right, that they're somehow entitled to be abusive. And they know what they're doing, and they're also not losing control of their anger, which is another myth that we hear a lot, right? But what actually happens is that they often plan the abuse.
Okay.
And if you're planning something, you're not exactly out of control. And that's a myth, though. We buy that all the time. That myth, the myth about mental health, and then another big one is substance abuse. You know, he only gets that way when he's drinking. I hear that a lot. And the fact of the matter is, you take alcohol away from a drunken batterer, and what you have is a sober batterer. Because they're two separate problems that often co-occur.
Domestic violence. Why is that so big, not only in our community, but our country, our world?
We haven't really scratched the surface yet on addressing it. And unfortunately, when we lose funds to work with victims, as we do every time there's a new president, you know, we risk losing VAWA, Violence Against Women Act funding, and people scramble. And so if you don't have as many shelters for abused people, both men and women, as you do animals, which is the situation in this country still, then we're showing that we don't value women and kids as much as we do animals.
What makes a person stay in a domestic violent relationship?
Well, they usually don't stay. It may take them a while to leave, and the ones who stay often know that they are at higher risk leaving. 75% of domestic violence murders happen after she's left or when she's saying she's leaving.
So how does that individual, how do you handle that? You know, what advice would you give someone when they're seeking that situation?
Well, there are a lot of safety measures in place. There are a lot of things out in the community, but there's no guarantee. Because some of these abusers, and when I refer to the abusers, I refer to them as men because the huge proportion of the problem is man's violence against women.
Correct.
And so until they're held accountable by the community, we can slap Band-Aids on as much as we want by offering shelter services, counseling services, you name it, for the victims, which includes both the partners and the children. But until we start holding the abusers accountable and standing behind our promise to the community that we have zero tolerance for domestic violence. How do we have zero tolerance?
Correct.
If we're not arresting, if we're not prosecuting, and if we're not sending these guys to programs like NCPAT.
Restraining orders. I mean, I know a lot of people say go and get a restraining order. Is that helpful? Do you feel like that's helpful?
Absolutely, absolutely. If nothing else, it shows a pattern of his domestic violence, and also it provides a paper trail in case he continues to escalate. But for most people, domestic violence, protective orders, restraining orders, whatever you want to call them, are going to keep him away from her.
But don't you feel like this will make him even more angry and want to get back at her?
Sometimes. But the guys that it really works on are those who've never been in trouble before, who haven't seen their abuse as abuse, and this is a wake-up call. So for those for whom it's a wake-up call, who have some remorse maybe for their behavior, or who don't want to lose the partner or the kids, then that could be really effective. For those who spend their days and nights planning how to stalk and abuse her, yeah, that's not going to work.
When you provide service for the abuser.
For the abuser.
Okay, when you're in a counseling session with an abuser, how do you separate from what they're telling you? Because I know it has to be a lot of emotion that has to go into your head, because you're kind of like thinking about the victim and what they're going through and all that, and why are you doing this to that individual? And so how do you separate, that feeling of, okay, why do you do the things you do?
I already know why they're doing it, because they all have the same reasons. Almost always. They all think that they're different from everybody else.
Correct.
And also they all think that they're the victims when they come into the program.
Okay.
Even if they've been convicted, they really honestly believe that they're the victims. And that's because they're in trouble for the first time sometimes. And they were hurt. And they may have just been hurt because they were arrested. But they're in pain. And you can see that pain, but it doesn't mean that they didn't do something pretty terrible to her. And so they all come in, not all, I'd say all, but I'm just talking about the huge majority, come in really strongly believing that if they can convince us that she's the abuser and that they are the victims, that we can put in a good word for them, I don't know, in court, but we're just a service provider.
Correct.
So they come to us, either they've acknowledged they've been abusive in some way, or they've been sent by the courts or by DSS, and we have to break through the defenses they put up against the information that we want to provide them. And the only effective way to do that is in a group setting with other guys who've been in the program longer. And it's these other guys, these other abusers, who explain to them how they came to understand the things that we're trying to teach them.
How long does it normally take when you're dealing with the abuser from day one for them to actually take that mask off and try to be real honest with you, so that you can provide them with the, with the knowledge that they need.
At the beginning, we have some that look like they're being honest, but they're usually just giving us like the tip of the iceberg. So they're being honest, but they're only being honest about a little part. We start seeing breakthroughs usually like the 6th to 8th week. They come to a group once a week for minimum 26 weeks up to 52.
Oh, okay.
And so usually if we're going to see change, we see it in the second month. But not always. Some guys go all the way to the end and then, well, bingo, I just got it.
Correct.
You just never really know, but usually that's it.
When they complete your program, what's the statistic of someone actually going back out and doing the same, offense?
Yeah, we really don't know.
You don't? Okay.
All we know is how many are rearrested, and we don't know whether that charge was really an intimate partner charge, because we consider domestic violence, and the domestic violence community considers domestic violence to be any pattern of coercive, controlling, or physically abusive behavior toward an intimate partner. And when I say pattern, I'm not talking about a pattern of arrest. I'm talking about a pattern of maybe starting with suggesting what she wears, or that they not go to her mom's house on Sundays anymore. And that's, begins the isolation. And so when you start looking at the patterns, there's a lot of domestic violence that's not criminal in nature. And so these guys come in, they've been caught or they've acknowledged usually a physical act of assault or a very real threat. And so they don't understand that all of these other behaviors were part of a pattern. So we start looking at all those other behaviors and the thinking and the belief system that was behind it. And then we start taking that apart and we start looking at how to change the underlying belief system. And it could be belief about relationships, about men, about women, and it's a lot of it is based on what the tapes playing in their heads tell them they're allowed to do and should do in relationships.
After someone completes your program and they've, been really crime-free for years, and they come back to you, how does that affect you? You know what I'm saying? Knowing that what you told that individual, or what your program has done, has provide this person with the knowledge that they need to actually not be abusive?
That's a really good question, because like any other behavior change, it's got to sink in and it's got to have reminders to stay there. Right? And like weight loss, I can go to Weight Watchers and I can lose weight and I can keep the weight off as long as I'm still going to Weight Watchers, as long as I'm still documenting all my food intake, right? But then I miss a meeting, then I miss 2 meetings, and then I don't have time to enter my food intake one day and the next. And pretty soon what happens is the calories, increase and I start seeing the weight creep back on. It's kind of the same thing. So we try to set up plans with them for seeing early signs of some of the earlier thinking returning and what to do. Now, my clients are allowed to return free of charge once they finish the program, and a lot of them will take advantage of that. So I've got guys who completed the program 10,